Multi-hazards, all about protecting communities.
Hi, everybody. This is the Multi-Hazards podcast, where we take a deep dive into issues in emergency management, climate change adaptation, security, etc. And the overarching goal here is protection, protecting communities. So welcome, Vin Nelson again here. And today I am so excited, thrilled to have an awesome guest, Robert W. Gray. He's a fire ecologist at R.W. Gray Consulting Ltd, researching fuel treatment effectiveness and the effects of past wildfires. He's also a regular contributor to the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC TV and radio, and their website, of course, and the local Vancouver Sun news on wildfire science and policy. So Robert W. Gray and his consulting company specialize in the research and application of many facets of wildland fire and ecological restoration. Fire research focuses on historic fire regimes and related ecosystem structure and composition, the immediate and long-term effects of applied fire, and integrated wildland fuels management, including the use of fuels to produce bioenergy. Ecological restoration focuses on elements of dry forest ecosystems, their historic fidelity and ecological integrity, and the application of restoration strategies. Wildland fire operations include the application of prescribed fire to meet specific resource management objectives. So Robert W. Gray and his company have been qualified burn boss in the United States and Canada since 1995. Wildland fire management includes the arenas of fuel hazard analysis and mitigation policy, education, social acceptance, and training. Clients and collaborators include Parks Canada, USDI Bureau of Land Management, USDA Forest Service, Canadian Forestry Service, Government of Mongolia, British Columbia Ministry of Forests and Range, BC Ministry of Environment, State of Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, the World Bank, University of British Columbia, UBC, University of Washington, University of Idaho, the Nature Conservancy, U.S., Nature Conservancy Canada, City of Cranbrook, City of Kimberley, Chelan County, Washington State, and numerous First Nations industry, legal, and environmental groups. Robert W. Gray has a Bachelor of Science from the University of Montana in both Fire and Forest Ecology. So, you are going to learn a lot about fire and forests today. I guarantee it. Well, dear listeners, it's my custom every single time before I start an episode to pronounce a territory acknowledgement. This is because of deep respect for First Nations people on whose land I podcast. I'm borrowing this from the neighboring Kwantlen Polytechnic University, or KPU. So here we go. We work, study, and live in a region south of the Fraser River, which overlaps with the unceded, traditional, and ancestral lands of the Kwantlen, Musqueam, Katzie, Semiahmoo, Tsawwassen, Kikite, and Quiquetlam peoples. These are the names of various First Nations groups around me here in Greater Vancouver on the west coast of Canada. Now, without further ado, let's get to the interview. Hi, everybody. This is the Multi-Hazards podcast, and we have somebody who is an expert today on wildfires, and Bob Gray. So can I call you Bob, or do you want Robert?
Bob is fine.
Robert. Okay, good. All right. Some names in English language, they kind of they go back and forth. It's hard to know which one. All right. So Robert W. Gray, and I've been following him for a couple years, actually, just on the British Columbia, Canada wildfire scene. And yeah, so Robert, it's a privilege because I've been reading your posts on LinkedIn. I see the CBC interviews, and I'm trying to keep up and learn more about the topic. So just wondering, how are you surviving these crazy COVID-19 pandemic times?
It's very, very busy. Not only the pandemic going on, but I mean, we've also got a pretty wet spring and summer so far, but that doesn't stop the research. It doesn't stop the operational plans from going ahead. Writing grants for next year's operations and research projects. So very, very busy. Not a lot of travel. Staying home mostly. I have been out once or twice just to check on things in the field, but it's kind of hunkered down and actually getting a lot of reading done.
Oh, okay. So, like, are you reading university textbooks, or what kind of thing are you reading?
Research, mostly research papers. There's just tons of great research being published almost on a daily basis. And a lot of it is focusing on how fire regimes are changing and climate change influences on fire, what we should be doing about these changes. So there's lots of stuff coming out, and it's actually hard to keep up with it all.
Oh, yeah, yeah, I can understand. Now, one thing I do want to say is I really respect you how you can read all this, and because I've been reading similar peer-reviewed articles, and sometimes I just like pause for a second, I look up in the sky or the wall, and I just kind of shiver because I'm kind of freaked out what's going to be happening to our families and communities in the future. So sometimes you have to kind of just like, okay, you got to grit your teeth and try to become emotionally, I don't know, balanced or centered, because it's not easy reading all this stuff and thinking about the future, is it?
No, it can actually be quite depressing when we look at where the science is taking us and where climate change is taking us. It can be it can lead you into quite a bit of depression and anxiety. What we have to do is recognize that we can still turn things around. We can still make a big change. It's likely going to mean some big changes in how we do things, but it's not all doom and gloom. We can still change the trajectory of things.
Right, exactly. Now, I've seen online your position is called Fire Ecologist, and I'd never heard of a position or a job like that.
Hmm.
And I'm just wondering if you could just briefly tell us about your background and why you chose this field, and then what is Fire Ecologist?
So a fire ecologist is someone who studies fire as a process and how it influences natural systems. We look at the effect of fire on organisms and ecosystems and stands and landscapes and fire behavior and fire effects, how they inform fire as a process. So there's a lot of sub-disciplines, ologist disciplines. There's geologists and geomorphologists and hydrologists and biologists and there's actually forest ecologists, and then there's fire ecologists. So it's a bit of a specialty field. It deals with processes, but in our case, it deals with fire. And I kind of stumbled into this. I was a University of Montana student started back in 1982 in Missoula, and one of my professors asked a group of us if we wanted to go to the experimental forest and do some burning, some pile burning. Forest debris. And sure, that sounds like fun. It's fire. It's out in the woods. And I just watched him and asked questions, and he had this very kind of quiet comfort with fire. Whereas the average person, when they start lighting things on fire, they can get a little bit exciting and a little bit dangerous. But he had this really kind of quiet comfort, and I asked him questions about that, and I just got hooked. So the advantage I had in that program at Montana was that fire was sprinkled through all of our classes: soils, range, recreation, hydrology, everything talked about fire and how it influenced different aspects of natural resources. And I got hooked, and that was back in 1982, and I've been in the field ever since.
Okay, wow. Now I'm just curious. I've seen a few movies about wildfires and then just urban fires, and there was one movie about a fire investigator, and the guy, I guess he lived in an old warehouse, and in the back he actually made this experimental lab where he'd just tried different fires and different I don't know, structures, and just on his own. So I wonder, do you have in your backyard a kind of experimental lab, and you take different kinds of trees and let's see how they burn? Or
No,
Because I mean, fire behavior is really tricky, right? You have to kind of observe, you have to smell it, you have to note down things. It's a real science and an art.
yeah, exactly right. It's both science and art. I mean, we can't possibly know everything about fire. In fact, some of our current efforts in understanding fire behavior is going on in places like Los Alamos, where they have giant room-sized computers. It's fluid dynamics. You're trying to understand the process of fire and how it behaves, and all the different variables that are affecting it, slope and weather and everything else. No, I don't have a lab in my backyard. What I had done through my career is I've been involved in a lot of prescribed burning and taken the opportunity on a lot of those burns to do some experimentation. Just measuring fire behavior, measuring fire effects. Lots of instrumentation where we have the time and resources to do it. So we do a lot of kind of in situ experimentation and try to understand how things are happening. And then there's large labs, like Missoula Fire Lab in Missoula, Montana is a very famous one. There's a couple in Europe. Riverside, California has a lab. Edmonton, the Canadian Forest Service has a lab. So there's a lot of folks who are doing a lot of that kind of really, really detailed, splitting out all of the various variables and controlling them kind of lab experiments. And then we're also trying to learn in the field.
Right. Now, I saw in one of your emails to me, you talked about community resilience as a goal. And my program here, my life theme for the next few decades too, is protecting communities. So I guess the word protection, the word resilience, are kind of similar. So I'm just wondering, what do you mean by community resilience?
It's a great question. And we've taken an approach, most recently with trying to protect communities from fire. And the reality is we're not doing a very good job. I mean, certainly look at cases recently in California and even cases here in the last decade or so. So resilience is more how do we build communities and how do we build landscapes where they can survive a fire? We're not going to stop all fires, and nor do we want to. I mean, there's a lot of benefit we get from fire, and actually lots of fire prevents big fires. So we want our communities and our critical infrastructure to be able to survive a fire. So what that means for communities is that the fire that comes to your town needs to be on the ground. It needs to be moving and spreading as a surface fire with very short flame lengths. The kind of fire that if it hits a paved road or a biking trail or something, it's likely going to stop, or it's going to hold it up and give us time to get suppression resources there. If it does come into the town, once again, it's on the ground. It's going to stop at green grass, things like that. We don't currently have our landscape set up that way. The kind of fire that hits our towns now is it's long flame lengths, it's crown fires, it's long range spotting, and it quickly overwhelms our resource capabilities. Around our communities, first responders are local fire departments. In a lot of cases, are rural BC, they're volunteer fire departments. They haven't had the 10, 15 years of experience and training that the provincial agencies do. They don't have the resources. So we have to create a safe work environment for them and the opportunity that communities can basically survive a fire. It's called fire hardening. We can't get away from having fires. They're going to happen, but we want to make sure that it's a safe work environment for firefighters, and they have the greatest opportunity to be successful. And if the fire does come into the town, it's not damaging.
Right. Now, I saw a video online of you, I think it was a couple years ago. You were in Kelowna, Penticton, somewhere in the Okanagan region of British Columbia, and some conference. And there was it's funny because they asked you questions, but it came out in text online, and then you answered. So I usually rip these YouTube videos and then listen to my car, and those kind of videos, they're not really helpful because it's what's the question? Anyways, but that was I can't remember, it was 5-6 minutes, but it was just packed full of great information. And I got the vibe that you're really concerned about climate change. You're not I don't know if climate change exists, but you're like right onto it. You seem very concerned. So I'm just wondering about, you were saying climate change and just the last 100 years of forest management after Europeans, etc., came to the land here and sort of took it over from indigenous peoples. The resource management has kind of built up in such a way that communities are in danger of big wildfires. So I'm just wondering about that kind of combo of climate change and the resource management.
Yeah, for sure. So it really is, it's a coupled thing. It's not only climate change, which is, I'll get to that in a second here, but it's also our resource management practices. So the two of them combined have created this really, really difficult situation that we're in. The resource management side, for about a century now, we've been very active on the land, basically in some cases starting in the late 1800s, harvesting, grazing ungulates, reducing fine fuels, leaving lots of slash on the land. We've homogenized forests. We've created kind of wall-to-wall forests across the landscape. And in a lot of places where, historically these landscapes were very heterogeneous. There was a lot of breaks in forest cover. There was a lot more grass cover, a lot more deciduous that kind of impeded fire flow, different age classes, different forest structure that basically kept fire sizes small. Historically, when we look at, reconstructions of stand structure and stand history throughout time prior to, about late 1800s, early 1900s, there was a lot of patches on the landscape, different age classes. And they functioned to slow down fire spread. And they also functioned to reduce fire severity, basically how damaging fires were. So fires, on average, were small. There was a lot of them, but they were small. So we homogenized things. We suppressed fires. We did harvesting. We consumed all that grass with livestock grazing. And we've created a condition where fire is a very strong contagion. It can move across landscapes because there's nothing to stop it now. There's nothing to slow it down. So we have that situation, which we've created. It's anthropogenic. We did that. And then there's climate change on top of it. So, all those emissions of carbon, we are seeing significant changes in our atmosphere. And that is leading to better conditions for fire to occur more frequently, burn hotter, and give us really kind of catastrophic effects. So things like, mean annual temperature has increased, especially increased in northerly latitudes. So central and northern BC has increased much, much quicker and much farther than the global average. We're not seeing the recovery overnight. When I started my firefighting career, back in the early 80s, we would expect that the humidity would rise at night and the temperature would go down and the fire would kind of lessen in behavior. It's not always happening now. We're actually seeing that burning period extending throughout the night. Temperature stays high, RH stays low, and fires stay active. Fire seasons are longer now. In some places by as much as 50 to 70 days, fire seasons are longer. California, you can argue that's a year-round fire season now. We're likely going to see some significant extensions in fire season too. More strong wind events, dry cold fronts coming through. We've recorded in the last 2 decades fires making amazing runs, 30 kilometers in one 8-hour period. Didn't happen so much before, in the past. Significant rainfall events, which can certainly dampen fire, but the worst thing is they're happening on top of recently burned patches. And that leads to very significant hydrologic events, damage to infrastructure, damage to water quality. So you have a lot of these compounding effects of changes in climate, which are really affecting how fire behaves.
Wow. So there's a couple of things I want to ask about. One thing is I just want to say that I was taking a course at University of Waterloo. I did like 4 courses, got a graduate diploma of climate risk management. But one course I remember, it was climate analytics. And so the professor, his name was Dr. Jeremy Pitney, got us to look in this Canadian government website. It basically gives historical archives of temperatures and precipitation. So I went to the closest weather station near my place outside of Vancouver, and I think it was like Pitt Meadows. So it's the only one that had records going back to like the 80s. So I looked at just the month of August. So 1980 to 1989. So it was averaging, I got my Excel sheet, I averaged out to about something like 17.3 degrees Celsius for the whole month of August from 1980 to 1989. Then I did another one from 2010 to 2019. And so that average was about 19.7 degrees Celsius. So I might be off a little bit here, but that's the general vibe. So I noted it went up around 2.3 or 2.4 Celsius from the period. And it's kind of like I'm a little bit older, so I can remember the 80s clearly. So it's kind of freaking me out because I know that young people might not know this, but time just flies, and something that's in the 80s, to me, it's just, I have fresh memories like yesterday. So it's just like, it's like nothing. It's like blinking your eyes, then boom, we're 2.4 degrees warmer in August. And of course, I know I have to look at the whole year and I have to look at other weather stations, but it was just kind of a little snapshot. And I think that night I couldn't sleep till like 3 a.m. I was freaking out about my family. And because the global increase should be like averaging 1. So Canada, we're even more. And then the northern part of Canada is even more. So I guess, yeah, I'll let you talk about that before I get to my second point here.
No, that's a great observation, and not to scare you even further, but one of the trends that's become more noticeable and it's most disconcerting is these extreme events. So what we saw in Australia, where we had the coupled drought with sort of great fire weather. If we think about climate change, there's a kind of the idea that we're going to see this gradual. If you looked at a curve, we're going to see this sort of gradual climb. A couple of tenths of degrees Celsius every year. It's going to end up out at 2 or 3 or 4 degrees. But that's a smooth line, and what's really happening is there's a lot of wobble in that line, and we're seeing extreme events. So it wouldn't be unusual to see an August where the average temperature was 25 degrees, and you've recorded 19 as the average. And the next year it may drop down to to 19, 17. But the reality is that under climate change, we're going to see more of these extreme events, and more extreme in the kind of worst case scenario for fire side of things. So that's what keeps me awake at night is, yeah, the averages are looking scary, but it's these extreme events that we are not prepared for. We don't do risk analysis very well that picks up extreme events because they're outliers. Well, the reality is we actually need to manage for the outliers.
All right. Sorry, you said outliers?
Outliers, yes.
Okay, what exactly is that again?
Well, so an outlier is, if you're looking at kind of a bell curve or some kind of other normalized distribution, you see most of your measurements are within this cluster. And then way out on one side of it is this one number. And that's an outlier.
Okay, and I think I remember that from a stats class I took.
Yes. So what a lot of the science now is recognizing that, our risk management, we don't consider outliers because they're considered to be really unpredictable events that have such low probability. And the reality is that they're likely going to increase in probability. We're just not looking at it that way. And the other problem with a lot of our risk management is we're basing it on past history and not future, what the conditions are likely going to be. So, one of the things that I always bring to some analysis or discussions about where we need to go is we shouldn't ignore those outliers. We should definitely take a close look at them and maybe not manage way out to extremes, but we should definitely be looking at how they're going to influence things.
Okay, so basically, I read a peer-reviewed article, and they were basically saying, don't do what Vin did and get just the average for August for a 10-year period. As you were saying, you got to look at some of those outlier extreme days because, it's just like anything. You could spend 10 years building a park or a structure, and then it can be destroyed in 15 minutes by a fire or something, a flood. So
Sure.
it's just like these outliers, they have impact that's could be decades long.
Yeah, and actually, and a good sort of, while we're in the middle of the pandemic, is looking at a kind of a virus analogy. We've sort of normalized the fact that we're going to have a seasonal influenza period, and we can look at how much the population is going to affect, and how to mitigate it, and how to do some risk analysis, and then along comes this COVID-19, which you would consider an outlier. It came out of nowhere. It's novel. It's brand new. We didn't know about it before. So, and we obviously globally we did not manage for that very well. We didn't have the capacity to deal with something of that magnitude and that intensity. So we missed that one. We shouldn't have. But if we look back at how we've approached these disasters, sort of trying to normalize them, then we're going to get bitten more frequently.
Right. I heard that actually, was it Harvard or was another big university in the US? They did an exercise, a drill, a simulation somewhere in October, November last year. And they invited all these, I think it was like FEMA in the US, et cetera, et cetera. And they basically practiced for a global pandemic. And they had all these plans. And it's like, well, I mean, at least for those participants, when COVID hit, they were kind of ready to go. But for everybody else, it was just like stumbling along. What are we doing? And then that stumbling was not just one day. It kind of dragged out month after month, still stumbling. So it's kind of funny how there'll be people in the corner who know everything, they're ready, but it's just that knowledge doesn't spread. So
no, and part of it is, I mean, our systems aren't really built well for these low probability events. It's got this, just really kind of remote probability it's going to happen. So if we're looking at, sort of risk management with public funds, it's like, well, we can't really manage to that because it's got a low chance of it occurring. But the reality is, if it does happen, it's got huge consequence to it. And we have to start to rethink that, a fair bit. It's that model's not serving us very well.
Mm-hmm. And one basis for my podcast too, I read an article about multi-hazards, and basically there was two authors, can't remember their name off the bat, but they're from King's College London, UK. So they were basically talking about there's multi-hazards has two things. One, it could be just consecutive, one after the other, which is kind of brutal. And then the second one was happening simultaneously. So it's kind of like dominoes. It's kind of like one thing hits another thing, hits another thing. And then there's this kind of effect. And people were wondering, can you do simulations on the computer, or is there a way that you can kind of think this through or use artificial intelligence to kind of predict? Because we're in a day and age where we have to do this kind of stuff. Some people might think, oh, this is like a video game. You're just kind of wasting your time on entertainment. But no, this is actually a thought experiment that could play out in the real world. And yeah, I know risk management is kind of based on the past experience and what is more probable, but it's like we got to start using our brains and kind of branching out there and imagining worst case scenarios. So sorry, that's a little spiel there.
Yeah, well, and on the multi-hazard side, I mean, you brought up a great point that, we have to be thinking about things in tandem. And a very, very common thread that we still have not picked up on managed very well with wildfires, it has a symbiosis with hydrology. We burn a site under high severity, which means it burnt really hot. It affected the soils. We develop these hydrophobic layers, which are water-hating layers when you convert it from the Latin, and it causes mass erosion events. Well, those kind of soil conditions can last for decades after fire. And what we're seeing from a lot of climate models is, we're going to have lots of extreme fire weather days, fire weather events, but we're also going to see changes in precipitation to less, kind of nice sort of drizzly rainy days to more big convective days. So that kind of, 5 centimeters of rain, per hectare per hour type of deal. When those things land on top of burn scars, it leads to major erosion, which can take out communities and take out watersheds and the whole bit. So there's a symbiosis between fire and hydrology and watershed damage that makes addressing the fire problem all the more pertinent and more critical.
Right. Now, just going back to something, I'm trying to figure out, there was this question in your video a couple of years ago talking about coniferous and deciduous trees. And that's kind of something that in my youth, if I studied it in a textbook, I would just memorize for an exam and then forget it the rest of my life. But I kind of got the vibe. What is it? Coniferous is evergreen, basically trees that kind of stay the same year round. And then deciduous is like leafy trees. And then there's a huge difference between coniferous / evergreen and then deciduous / leafy in fires and making what do you call fire breaks or fire, just protecting places from the spread of fire, right? There's a big difference between those two kinds of trees, right?
Yeah, correct. So conifer trees are, in the forest industry, they're called softwoods. They have a different fire ecology than deciduous trees or hardwoods. And deciduous broadleaf trees, you picture maple, oak, aspen, cottonwood, they don't burn very well. They tend to have pretty high moisture content, so they don't burn very well. Conifer trees, their needles tend to have high flammability. There's a lot of volatile resins in conifer needles. So conifer trees crown out and burn quite well, and deciduous trees don't. Pure deciduous forests tend to trap moisture below the canopy. So if you walked through a deciduous forest on a 35-degree day in the interior, you would experience temperature drop about 10 or 15 degrees. It'd be cooler, it'd be more humid, more moist. The grasses would still be green, shrubs would be green, herbs would be green. You step out, into an adjacent conifer forest, and the grasses are probably cured. It's very dry. You can smell the terpenes in the air. And that's a really big difference. And historically on our landscapes, we had a lot of deciduous. First Nations people burned a lot for survival. There was lots of, fires lighting through lightning. And deciduous trees respond really well to fire. They resprout. They're highly fire adapted. And they were one of those sort of patch types on the landscape that broke up fire flow. They prevented fires from spreading to large areas. Modern day, firefighting, we look to those as safe zones, places where we can go and hunker down when we're in danger from a fire. But we don't have a lot of them. We've chosen to manage the landscapes for conifer trees and not deciduous trees. And there's a lot less of them out there. And the future in BC or Western Canada or North America, when it comes to actually, managing fire, is producing more deciduous forest.
Mm-hmm. All right. So just wondering about what's this word landscape scale?
Mm-hmm. So landscape scale is it's an idea that we have to be doing things in large areas. If we go and we treat 10 hectares around a community, we're not doing anything. When we've got 20,000 hectare fires, a 10 hectare treated area, the fire isn't even going to notice it. So if in the future we're concerned about these 20,000, 40,000, 100,000 hectare fires, then we have to be doing mitigation at a similar scale. We have to be treating areas that the fire is actually going to be influenced by. So landscapes are the unit that we look at for that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, I'm also just wondering about, I know the connection with climate change. I guess we're mostly talking about adaptation, but then there's the whole mitigation side and how many greenhouse gases are going into the atmosphere. So I'm not sure about methane or what was that? The third, fourth, fifth kind of gases, but there's carbon, which is basically number one. So when you get all these wildland fires, there's carbon going up there, and then trees that are unburnt basically are absorbing the carbon. Isn't that right?
Yeah, that's correct. So our forests are absorbing carbon dioxide through photosynthesis, and they store it into wood fiber and roots and everything else. And then when a fire occurs and we have combustion, then we release carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrous oxides, and methane. And they are contributing to the greenhouse gas effect. So the 2017 and 2018 fire seasons in BC, where we had those 1.2 million hectares burned in both years, we emitted 3 times as much carbon compounds as we do from all other sources. So in BC, on an average year, about 63 million tons are released through fires, through industrial activities, everything else. We emitted 180 million tons both of those years, each year. Right. So that's contributing to climate change. And one of the things that we discuss in the fire side of things is this positive feedback loop. So the more carbon that goes into the atmosphere, the more it changes our climate and our weather, and it influences fire behavior. Well, more extreme fire behavior, we get more carbon. So you can see how we're stuck in this very positive loop, and we can't seem to be able to get out of it. Getting out of it actually means we have to use fire to create resilient forests that can survive fire. We have to occasionally burn them through prescribed fire, but these fires are very low emission fires. They, if all we're doing is burning fine fuels and grass, then they don't emit a lot of carbon relative to a wildfire.
Right. Just for our audience, I just want to let everybody know, if they haven't figured this out yet, positive feedback loop, when you use the word positive, it sounds positive, right? But this is actually a negative thing. This means that you're reinforcing bad things, right? You're reinforcing a cycle that's basically making things worse and worse and worse. It's like that multi-hazards domino cascading effect that I think I was talking about. So,
exactly.
Yeah, now I remember, I'm trying to think of the title of this movie I watched. It was like Josh, what's his name? Brolin? It was about this wildland firefighters group, and then they ended up dying. I think it was in somewhere in the US. But I remember in a scene in the movie, so he was looking with his fire chief, like over, it wasn't a fire chief. It was like, anyways, it was one of his bosses. And he was looking over these hills that were full of trees, forests, and he said, other people see trees and nature and a beautiful sunset. Me, I see fuel. So I was just thinking about what you've said in the past about this whole thing about the surplus of fuel and woody biomass. Now there's like what burns on top of the forest, there's what burns, I guess, in the middle, but then there's the floor, the surface level, the ground level. So is that what you're talking about for fuel, or are you just talking about all three, like top, middle, and bottom?
Yeah, it's our terminology is a fuel bed. So, and a fuel bed includes both ground fuels, which is duff and litter and roots, surface fuel, as you just referred to, which is logs and grasses and branches, and then there's aerial fuels, which is the tree canopy. So I look out and I see a fuel bed, which is all three of those in aggregate. So
okay, so now I'm trying to figure out, there was you and some other people in BC were basically advising the government to send teams in or somehow clear out the forest floor. Is that correct?
Yeah. So our best strategy for mitigating fire behavior and mitigating climate change effects from fire behavior are to thin the forest, sometimes change the species from hardwoods or from conifers back to deciduous. A lot of times it's just to thin out the forest, clean up the surface fuels so that if there is a fire, that the fire doesn't kill all the trees. It has low emissions, and it's doing a lot of good. It's doing what we want fire to do. And that is sometimes it can be done with manually by crews. And other times you want to do it mechanically, with harvesting equipment and skidders and do something with the material. When we look at the scale of our sort of hazardous fuel bed problem in the province, um, we are looking in the billions of tons of biomass that needs to be removed, and we need to do
Wow.
something with it.
Well, there's a lot of people idle because of COVID-19. Maybe we can do something like the U.S. did in the 1930s. Just send them out there and pay them a living wage. I don't
Yeah,
know.
the Civilian Conservation Corps did some good for sure.
Yeah. So, all right. So there's that fuel on the ground. Now, actually, I went to a place across the river from me. What was it? City of Coquitlam. So the firefighters there were doing some presentations on properties that are basically on the edge of the community facing the forest. And they were telling everybody to, they call it fire smart. So basically clean the junk off your roof, trim your trees, maybe choose better trees in your yard. But one of the important things they were saying is you got to clean up all the junk and debris and stuff on your lawn and on your grounds, because that's the stuff which will catch fire, and then it'll kind of like go like what are those TNT fuses along the ground. It'll end up in your house, right? Is that right? That's kind of like fire smarting. This is what like an individual, if they have their own property, they can do it, right?
Yeah. So FireSmart is one of those programs, FireWise in the States, and there's a couple, basically they're all around the world. If you look at the vulnerability of your home, it's to either direct flame impingement, a fire runs right up to your house and radiant heat, ignites the structure, or an ember lands on a, flammable surface. And, if you're home, you can put it out with a garden hose, but if you're not home, it can very slowly eventually penetrate, into your house and get the internal structure going. So our two biggest vulnerabilities are, the landscaping around our home and those, flammable surfaces that an ember can land on. So with FireSmart or FireWise programs, you want to change the landscaping so that you don't have direct flame impingement. Green grass, lava rock next to the house, paving stones. If you have conifer trees, make sure they're limbed up. All those sort of things that make your property inflammable. And then the second thing is basically, your home construction. And that's where they talk about, cleaning the needles and leaves out of your eaves, making sure that, your vents are very, very tight mesh, not leaving windows open or attics open, not having a combustible roof like cedar shakes. All those things that, basically can lead to an ember landing on your structure and very, very slowly burning its way into. And then once it's internal, it's going to get your house going. So those are the program sort of focuses when it comes to FireSmart and FireWise.
So I guess even at a community level, you could have, I know here where I live, they have people adopting streets, right? And then you'll have maybe once every couple of weeks, you'll have a team of people with these, what do you call it? These pickup kind of things they use in their hand. They're like these stick things, and then they put all the junk into these garbage bags. So maybe communities need to also not just do their own houses, but they need to do like the community around. What do you think about that?
Oh, for sure. The most successful of these programs are the ones where, everybody takes part. The reality is, you can do all you can on your property. If your neighbor hasn't, and if your neighbor's house catches on fire, it's going to burn at really, really high temperature, and it could ignite your property as well. So these things only work if it's a collective that does it.
Right.
In individual homes don't do it. And a couple important notes are that it's expensive. And this isn't a one and done. I mean, you have to do this every year, and it can be quite expensive to do.
Right. I'm wondering if our laws here, I guess it depends on the place, but What if, you got like in Vancouver here, we got these empty houses that are being taxed extra by the government. Somebody, whatever, may have laundered their money or they just bought it and they're like on the other side of the planet. And then, yeah, you get all kinds of stuff building up on the property over time. And then you're like, oh, that's my neighbor. And what am I going to do? What if there's going to be some legal mechanism that basically the community can just say, hey, we have the a warrant to go into the neighbor's house and fire smart it. So I don't know if that
Yeah,
exists, but I think it would be a good idea to protect communities instead of relying on somebody at the other side of the planet. You don't even know their name, that the house is owned by a shell company or something.
yeah. There's jurisdiction. There's a lot of different avenues to take, and some jurisdictions are very, very heavy-handed with bylaws, and others are, sort of relying on a more of a voluntary approach. There's, I think, some of the most successful examples are where there's actually a bit of a carrot and stick approach. Here's the program. We will help you to a certain degree with the program. If you don't, then here's the heavy hand of the bylaw, and I think those have kind of worked the best. Um, but like I said, it's quite expensive. Brand new home construction, you can build it fire smart, um, not too expensively. But existing structures, that's the tough part. Changing out a shake roof is in the high thousands of dollars. Changing out bay windows, things like that. In rural communities where we're dealing with, pandemic and recessions and things like that, and people's employment is questionable, getting people to do this stuff, is not going to happen.
Yeah, that's kind of, I remember, what was it? Vancouver, city of Vancouver in the pandemic. This is like after a month or two. They asked provincial government to basically bail them out because you know, they're financially in trouble. And I'm thinking, wow, you know, some municipalities were doing well. I guess they had saved their pennies for a rainy day, but some cities no, and or they're maybe too top heavy, too many staff, too much stuff going on. But yeah, it's this COVID-19 impacting the economy. It's actually going to have some influence on whether or not people fire smart, or it's like the poor person. They don't bother buying house insurance because they can barely pay their heating bill or electricity bill. So yeah, it's kind of a tightrope walk.
It really is. I mean, you're looking at people who have to prioritize between food and medicine and shelter or fire smarting their home, um, and it's going to be a pretty simple choice. Now, after a couple of years of really horrendous, not only home and property losses, but lives lost in California, there's been some very interesting conversation amongst university professors who influence the insurance industry that maybe actually investing in helping people um, fireproof their homes and properties is better than canceling their policy. Um, you're sitting on billions of dollars worth of revenue and savings, and maybe invest it back in these communities and help these people get their homes up and in good shape, and then maintain collecting a policy from them.
Hmm. I'm wondering, is there like a quick and dirty way to do this fire smarting? Like, has anybody kind of experimented and said, okay, how can we do this like the cheapest as possible and use volunteers? And let's have a competition between groups, who can do this cheaper than the other person. Is there anything you've heard of like that?
It's so variable. The state of the property, the vegetation, the home construction. Sometimes it's really simple. I know there's a lot of communities that do summer chipping programs where they have a chipper and a dump truck, and if you can bring your flammable juniper hedges roadside, they can chip it up and take it off your hands. And sometimes that's all that's needed, just getting rid of those juniper hedges. Other times it's lots of debris. It's tall grasses. It's ladder fuels. You've got a shake roof, outdated building construction. and you're looking at tens of thousands of dollars. So it is just so variable.
Right, right. Well, I'm hoping that Canada and other countries in the future can look at all the costs and basically come up with a volunteer model where they can get masses of volunteers and just get her done. So that's my hope, crossing my fingers and seeing if there's some lobbying that can be done in that regard. So now I'm just wondering, you were talking about this whole pattern about you've already alluded to it, this pattern in British Columbia and other places where, yeah, we haven't managed the forest as good as Indigenous people did in the past, and we've let it build up, and then we have climate change. So I'm just wondering about this whole pattern now. What else do you think we can do about this to kind of break some negative patterns and then bring in something that can make a change?
That's a good question. There's a lot of things that we can do. I mean, we have a very active forest, harvest industry in BC. About 190,000 hectares are harvested every year. Um, there's a lot of things we can do. We can direct harvest in places where it's going to have the greatest effect. We can model, very, very active fire flow areas. We kind of know where fire is going to move more frequently in places where it's not likely to move more frequently. Steep north aspects don't burn as frequently as steep cool aspects don't burn as frequently as steep warm aspects. Um, and we can steer harvest into those places. We can encourage, very, very clean harvesting, high utilization, steer that material that's not good for plywood or dimension lumber into the bioeconomy, both bioenergy fuels and engineered wood products, get it off the land, and then prescribe burn. And then we plan after that, and we know that those patterns, impact fire flow. We look back at, areas that burnt in 2018, and there's these green squares all across the landscape. And those were areas that back in the 80s and 70s were harvested and then prescribed, burned, and then planted. And they all survived because there's just no fuels there. So we can learn a lot of those things. Where we plant deciduous into good sized patches of deciduous, we can break up fire flow. A lot of these post-harvest practices around cleaning up things is important. If a hillside burns, steep, warm aspect hillside, don't replant it. Let it come back to grass. Reburn it occasionally so that it stays in short grass and it's going to impede fire flow. There's a lot of things we can do, and we can actually look back at historic photographs and see how those patches function in the landscape and the impact that they had on fire and forest resilience, and start to copy those. And then run model simulations on what's going to happen with those patches and dynamics under, RCP 4.5 or RCP 8.5, changing climate conditions. And from that, get an idea of what we need to do in the future.
Right. Now, I'm just wondering, in your consulting practice, this is what you do on a daily basis?
I do. I do a combination of research. I work with colleagues in the Canadian government, Canadian universities, and U.S. government and U.S. universities. I do work with communities on trying to reduce fire threat to communities. It's a fair bit of both of those.
Okay. Sounds like you have a lot of freedom there.
I've been very fortunate in my career. I did spend time with federal agencies and tribal groups in the U.S. And here in Canada, I worked for industry. I've seen all the different sides of this debate, and I kind of landed on consulting, and I've just been very lucky to have a very successful career so far.
Wow, that's awesome. Now, just a quick question about Canada and the U.S. Do you see, is there any generalized differences between the forest and also wildland fire management between the two countries?
No, not a lot of difference. They're both struggling with the same problems. I mean, the amazing thing is you could take the border away, and we're trading fires back and forth, we're trading smoke back and forth, and we trade resources back and forth. No one has really gotten a good handle on this. The U.S., the one area where the U.S. is I think in better shape is more aggressive use of prescribed fire. There's states in the southeastern U.S. where they burn millions of acres a year, millions of hectares a year. In the West, they do a lot more prescribed burning. Use of managed wildfire, which is you get a wildfire ignition and you kind of sort of pre-plan the landscape and you allow it to burn. We're moving into more of that here in BC, which is fantastic. We're still way behind on prescribed burning, which we need to address that. But the rest of it, we're all still struggling. How do we move billions of tons of biomass?
Right. Now, I'm just really curious. That's probably a real dumb question, but is there any connection with Russia and all that? Because I'm thinking in this planet, it's kind of weird. Yeah, we connect with Australia because, we were used to be a British colony and they were a British colony. But if you think about it from a global perspective, Russia has probably got more a common geography. So is there any connections with that country? It's kind of an off tangent question here, but I'm curious.
Yeah, within the scientific community, there's they're part of the network. I don't know that they have a very extensive fire research community. I know there's a number of people who we see at conferences and colleagues of mine in the fire science community. They do collaborate with them, but I don't think it's that strong. And fires in Russia, especially in Siberia, there's not a lot of resources put on those fires, and they're more or less just allowed to burn. The network there isn't as strong as it is between Canada and the U.S. and Canada and Spain, for example, and Southern Europe and Canada and Australia.
Oh, what about the Nordic countries?
Well, you see, up until recently, there really wasn't much of a fire issue there. Lots of discussion about Scandinavian country forest practices. But, in the last decade, Sweden has certainly seen a significant increase in fire activity. Other Nordic countries have as well, as has Russia. I mean, the fires going on north of the Arctic Circle in Siberia right now are quite disconcerting. So I would suggest that there will likely be a greater research emphasis collaborating with those folks.
Because I heard, for example, that there are some, what do they call it, geopolar networks between Russia, Northern Canada, Greenland, I guess Denmark, and just Nordic countries that there is some, of course, there's like competition, who's going to take over the shipping lanes in the north, because now the ice is breaking up China, Russia, US, Canada, was it Denmark? Everybody's up there trying to get it. But there has been some collaboration in other fields. So I'm just wondering, could this happen in the future? Should there be people pushing for that? Because it might just benefit everybody.
Oh, that's a great point. It's each individual country trying to, in isolation, solve this problem isn't going to do it. Not when we have the emissions that we have. Everyone has to take part. Trying to control emissions coming out of the Amazon rainforest or the rainforest in Sumatra. Trying to limit emissions coming out of eucalypt forests in Australia and the taiga and the boreal forests in Russia and Canada. When we look at on an annual basis, the amount of emissions due to wildfire, it's so significant that we're going to have to work collaboratively as a global community to solve this problem.
Right. Now, I don't know if this is part of your field, but is wildfire smoke, is it something you have studied a lot about?
I haven't done research on wildfire smoke, but I do have to consider it. And when I do prescribed burning, a lot of our planning is based on trying to limit the amount of smoke either through wildfires or through prescribed fires. And I do training for prospective burn bosses, so we do talk about smoke management strategies.
Okay. Yeah, because I did some research. What was it? Is it last summer? Yeah, last summer. And I was kind of freaked out. I was thinking maybe it's actually the smoke that's worse than the fire, because fire, it's in a particular geographic region. Yeah, it does a lot of damage. But this smoke, it just comes up and then it kind of engulfs San Francisco or some what is it, Whitehorse, Yukon, or Anchorage, Alaska, or whatever. It does a lot of damage, and it's different than fire because this smoke kind of seeps in everywhere, and it can travel really far. So, anyways, I just so many things to be concerned about, eh?
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, it's we do have to be very careful with smoke. Although when we talk about trying to have a positive influence on wildfire and getting the most positive benefit from fire, we have to recognize that there's no smoke option. We are going to be producing smoke. It's making sure that it's not massive quantities, and people are exposed to acute levels and not chronic. So human health effects really kick in when there's chronic exposure. So they're 6, 8, 9 weeks over the summer, they're just inundated with smoke is not good. But if we're going to do a 2-day prescribed burn in March, which is acute exposure, we don't see the same health effects. And we've actually worked with, pulmonologists and cardiologists with this. And for the most part, they're very much in favor. We have to have prescribed fire. We have to have smoke. But if we can limit the amount and the duration, then our human systems can actually deal with it pretty well.
Right. Now I'm wondering, do you do advisory consulting kind of work with any of these wildland fire crews or their companies or the government?
No, not so much. I do work with the government on prescribed burning. We do prescribed burning in the East Kootenays with local government, and BC Wildfire Service is part of our team. But I don't do wildland fire suppression work anymore.
Okay. All right. Now, I wanted to mention this. We already talked about climate change, but you did this presentation. It was called what? Climate Change 2018 Retooling, and there was a PowerPoint. And I remember reading, you were talking about the effects of climate change. So I'd like to read it quickly here. So you said there's a later start to, and I'm paraphrasing, later start to winter snow and earlier snow melt, then there are hotter summers, more lightning, less rain in the fire season, more string convective storms, so that's called dry lightning, more string windstorms, more frequent, longer, worsening droughts. The climate change has an effect on cyclical weather anomalies, bottom-up influences in fire and fuels, trees dying, weakening, getting more bug-infested. Live and dead fuels will dry out, be available to burn earlier, longer. There's an annual increase in burn area, larger patches of high-severity fire, more reburns, failed reforestation, and then there'll be a cumulative effect in wildfires, and then the costs will be astronomical, direct, indirect, additional. And for example, one evacuation you stated in Cranbrook in British Columbia, Canada, it was astronomical, the cost, and then there's social consequences. So I want to back up there for a second. What is this string convective storm, dry lightning?
Strong convective storm.
Oh, strong. Okay. I thought string was kind of this is a buzzword. Okay. So strong. Oh my goodness. I think the I and the O are beside each other on the keyboard, right? So yeah, what is dry lightning?
Dry lightning is when you have cumulus buildup that it doesn't produce strong enough, volume of moisture that it actually reaches the ground. I mean, when you start to see some buildup occurring and you start to get the down push through the downdraft in the system, it's got moisture in it, but it's just not strong enough to reach the surface of the ground. So you get a little bit of virga, which is that little shadow beneath the canopy or beneath the cell, but it doesn't reach the ground. But you've built a towering cell that's significant to produce lightning. So you get a cell passing through. It's got a little bit of virga underneath it, or very, 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 very light rain, but lots of lightning. So.
Right. And what is this thing? It's cyclical weather anomalies.
Yeah. So you've heard of El Nino and La Nina. So that's a cyclical weather anomaly. So research has has, developed or identified these patterns like El Nino, La Nina, um, and they're actually made stronger by changes in climate. The other one that we're noticing is these pools of warm water off the west coast that can actually drive a lot of our weather systems. So they're getting stronger. So this is just more evidence of these extreme events.
Right. Now, I know there were some news reports, and it seemed they were coming out of these media companies that seem to put out information from these so-called climate change deniers, and they're like, yeah, it's not from climate change, nothing to do with climate change, all these, it's and they'll kind of push aside all those climate change kind of connections, and they'll say, oh, it's just because of there are people, they're arsonists running around setting forests on fire, and maybe it's a lot of people dumping their barbecue coals or throwing their cigarettes into the forest to see how fast it'll burn. I don't know. What do you think about that kind of debate that seems to play off every summer, especially when some of these climate change denying media outlets start putting out this stuff online?
Well, I mostly just ignore it, but I do know it's an issue, and the scientific community does need to address it. And for the most part, they've produced, very compelling research evidence and modeling evidence that there is definitely a climate signal. We have to recognize that an individual fire, it's not a climate signal. It's a fire season. So what happened in Australia in 2019 on a seasonal basis of a fire season, definitely had a climate signal to it. Very, very deep, prolonged drought. And then, once you start to get starts, dry lightning, strong winds, lack of precipitation, those were all very anomalous sort of patterns that were way outside the norm. And so there's a very, very strong climate change signal to that. The landscape was set up for those events through our management. So we can create the climate change weather that can, affect the fire season, but it has to be coupled with how we've affected fuels. And then the two of them combined give us what we've seen in the last couple of decades.
Right. But do you think it seems kind of weird? Does it seem like there's arsonists running around in the summers?
No, it's just there's just no evidence to support that. I mean, it was certainly thrown out. I think in Australia, there were arsonists starting these fires, but we've got excellent lightning detection now. Yeah, I mean, here in BC, I think it's 40% of fires on average are human caused. A vast majority of those are accidental. It's a vehicle fire, you're parking a vehicle with a hot catalytic converter on grass or something, or it's timber harvesting or mowing and you hit a rock or a cigarette. We don't have that kind of, arson problem that they have in other jurisdictions. Like Chile, Greece, the Mediterranean, there's actually a fair bit of arson that goes on there, but we just don't see it here.
Right. I was on a holiday with my family to Vancouver Island, and then this was like two years ago when there was lots of fires happening all over BC, and we couldn't go anywhere. So we thought, okay, let's look at the map. Vancouver Island, there's not much like smoke there and not too many fires. So went over there. It's funny, stayed there for, I can't remember, it was like a week or so. And then on the ferry ride back, there was this forest fire, like right beyond the Nanaimo ferry there on the hills. And then I don't know how I found out. I was looking online, and somebody said that somebody was like shooting up there in the hills, and their ricochets of the bullets off the rocks sort of sparked fire. And then I was kind of like, how did they find that out? But I guess what this is, what do you call fire investigation? Like they'll try to find out how that thing started, and I don't know why they need to know. Is it just curiosity or for insurance purposes?
Yeah, fire cause investigation is actually a pretty sophisticated science, and it is, you want to find out the cause of the fire because there may be opportunities to recover the costs, and and if you need to prosecute people. I mean, if there is intentional fire starts going on, then you need to make sure that the individual doing that is not going to cause continued problems. So fire cause investigation is quite sophisticated.
Okay. Now I'm wondering if there are anybody who's like, say, whatever, teenager, young adult, people middle-aged, they want to change their careers. If they want to go into this kind of field that you're in, what would you advise them to do? I'm not saying you want competition in the future, right? They're going to be like, yeah, we're going to take all your government contracts. But just, I mean, really, we do need more people, more boots on the ground, more minds with different thinking out of the box. So what kind of advice would you give?
Um, a well-rounded background in fire is a lot of on-the-ground experience. Making observations, building a mental model of fire behavior and fire effects is really important. Certainly, the classroom education, understanding the science, is important. So it's really a combination of the two. So getting onto an agency fire crew for the summer. Getting a lot of exposure to fire on the ground, asking a lot of questions, making a lot of observations, taking notes, taking pictures, and then getting into the classroom and studying fire. We are looking at how to build capacity in BC. I'm one of the few fire ecologists in the province. So I'm working with UBC Okanagan to develop a professional fire science certificate program.
Okay. So do you have any connections with Dr. Laurie Daniels?
Now, Laurie and I collaborate quite a bit.
Okay, yeah, because it's every time I look at the news, it's either you or Lori just, giving advice. So it's kind of like you're the go-to people here in British Columbia, I guess.
It would appear that way.
Yeah. So, but what about me? So I'm planning on going into emergency management, and I just want this as one of the tools under my belt. And, instead of maybe watching a Netflix movie one night, I'll spend an hour and a half just trying to read up on this stuff, or maybe I'll go outside and, burn a couple sticks and watch how it burns. But is there any advice as just some lay people who don't really want to focus on this entirely, something that I could do, you think?
There's tons of excellent educational material online. You can go to the BC Wildfire Service has some information on their website. There's probably a lot more in the U.S. U.S. Forest Service, National Wildfire Coordinating Group has a lot of educational materials. The Nature Conservancy, U.S. Park Service, lots of really, really good free material, videos and stuff that you can take a look at and just kind of educate yourself.
Okay. Maybe if I have a friend who's a farmer and they have like a grove and they're like, they want to burn one patch, I'll say, hey, I'll do it. And then I'll just maybe videotape part of it, take photos before, during, and after. And I don't know. I really want to learn this stuff. I think that emergency managers, for example, that they need to just keep broadening their minds and keep learning every day, right?
Yep, exactly.
Right. And do you ever like collaborate with emergency managers, or do you have any connections with them?
I work with some small community fire departments. Right now, we're trying to develop burn boss capacity in a couple of communities so that we can actually carry out more prescribed burning in the future.
Right. Okay. Now, I don't want you to tell everybody your secrets here, but I know you're doing all this research on peer-reviewed articles. But what's your next iron on the fire that you're willing to let everybody know?
I'm working with the Pacific Forestry Center, USDA Forest Service, and with the Laureate UBC on a large wildfire and carbon study that's been funded by the provincial government, so provincial and federal governments. So we're looking at broad scale across BC and Western Canada, and how do we solve this positive feedback loop that we were talking about earlier.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm looking forward to seeing that published. Now, I'm just wondering, do you have a last message for the audience?
Not. I mean, usually, if I'm asked that question, it's just for people to be careful with fire, but start to learn more about it, it's not, the big, boogeyman that is perceived to be, or at least it was for almost a century. It's important that we have fire in our landscapes. It's important to understand more about it, and just be careful and fireproof your homes, and that's about it.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. I really appreciate it, Robert, and just stay on the line after I cut it here. I'll edit this out. But yeah, thank you so much for participating in the Multi-Hazards podcast. And I know that it's really important to get this message out to the world, more than just like a 2-minute soundbite on Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, CBC interviews, right? So thanks a lot. And you have a great day and a great weekend.
Yeah.
There it is, a very inspiring interview with Robert W. Gray. Thank you again, Robert, for being a wonderful guest here at the Multi-Hazards podcast. So, little disclaimer that I add to each episode. This podcast is meant to be educational and does not try to offer legal, medical, or other specific advice unless otherwise noted. Also, the opinions expressed here do not necessarily reflect those of the organizations that the host, that's me, Vin Nelson, or guests are part of. So, here as I wrap up this episode, a special thanks to all of you precious listeners for tuning in today. Stay safe out there and stay tuned for more. This is Vin Nelson wishing you the best on your journey of surviving and thriving with all that life throws at you. Cheers to you all. Peace out.